My wife invited some guy to a party. They tied me up and started laughing. When I broke up with her, he was jailed, and he promised to get revenge. Time has a peculiar way of slipping through your fingers. I remember when I first moved to the city after a difficult period in my life. The streets felt foreign, the skyline filled with both hope and uncertainty. I sold my car, choosing a simpler lifestyle where everything I needed was within walking distance. I did indulge in a Harley, my dream bike, which became my go-to for clearing my head. The daily walks to work and the quiet evenings alone in my apartment became my new routine. I welcomed the solitude after the chaos of my last relationship. The silence was a relief. Mornings, in particular, felt like a fresh beginning. I left home early while the city was still waking, savoring the calm before the day's demands took over. My job at a manufacturing company was the most stable thing in my life. And yet, even in those small moments, I noticed how quickly time was flying by. As I dropped a letter into the mailbox one day, it hit me. I had already been living there for a year. Time flies, I thought to myself as I continued my walk to work. I had chosen a condo close to the office to keep life simple. With shops and restaurants nearby, my motorcycle was reserved for weekend rides to escape the routine. At 6 a.m., the streets were almost deserted, and I made it to my office in under 15 minutes. After brewing coffee, I sifted through emails, mostly junk, though a few contained important updates. By 7:10, I had reviewed sales figures and the previous night's production data. The office slowly filled with people as I continued my work. As the purchasing manager, I oversaw about a third of the 175 employees. I had been with the company for 6 years, and in the past few months, I had gained a reputation as a rising star. I worked long hours, typically arriving around 6 a.m. and not leaving until after 7:30 p.m. My job had consumed my life. Today was month end, so I double-checked inventory, delayed 2 shipments, and ensured all shop orders were closed. My boss, Ken, popped in on his way out. "What are you still doing here?" "You've done great. Go home," he urged. "I'm just finishing up," I replied. "Seriously, take a break. The office is closed tomorrow for fumigation. Enjoy your weekend," Ken said as he left. I finally headed out after 8 p.m. As I walked home, I noticed couples out for drinks and dinner while I was returning to my condo alone. My place was a renovated 2-bedroom unit with a large balcony that overlooked a park and a lake. I loved taking early morning walks around the lake on weekends. When I got home, I saw the light blinking on my answering machine. I didn't bother checking the messages. I just deleted them all. I grabbed an open bottle of wine from the fridge, uncorked it, and poured a glass from my collection of crystal glasses. I had recently decided there was no point in saving the good glasses for special occasions. Wine in hand, I turned on the TV and opened my laptop. AOL notified me of 6 new emails, 2 from eBay, 1 from my parents, 2 from my friend, and a spam email promising a way to make money from home. I'll check them tomorrow, I thought, heading to the kitchen. I had remodeled the kitchen shortly after moving in, transforming it into something out of a gourmet magazine. A 6-burner stove, double ovens, stainless steel appliances, granite countertops, and even a wine cooler. After struggling with sleep for a while, I realized that I needed to physically exhaust myself to get any rest. So, I converted the 2nd bedroom into a home gym. Every night, I worked out hard between 9 o'clock and 10 p.m., then took a cold shower, had one last glass of wine, and went to bed. Over the past year, I had slimmed down from 195 pounds to a lean 175. Dinner was always simple. Since I got home late, I didn't cook much. Instead, I had local meals prepped and frozen for convenience. That night, it was steak, peppers, and rice, ready in minutes. With another glass of wine, I watched the news, but it was the same cycle of violence, scandals, and brainless reality shows. I turned off the TV and headed to my workout room. I warmed up with 20 minutes on the treadmill, stretched for another 15, and then began the real workout. 30 to 45 minutes of punches and kicks on the heavy bag. Each punch felt like I was releasing a piece of my past. As a kid, I trained in martial arts at a strict dojo. After months of begging, my dad finally enrolled me, but it was harder than I had expected. The sensei didn't tolerate slacking and pushed us to our limits. After 2 months, I wanted to quit, but my dad wouldn't hear of it. I paid for a year, and you're going to finish it, he told me. I stuck with it, and that's when I met Nick. He was a year older and bigger, but we became best friends. We trained together, and I always gave it my all, even when Nick complained that my kicks were too strong. By the time I earned my second-degree black belt, though, I was more interested in girls, and I left the dojo. Nick quit a couple of years before I did, but we both remained good friends. It was nearly 11 p.m., and I was drenched in sweat. I peeled off my clothes, tossed them into the hamper, and stepped into the shower. The cold water refreshed me as I washed the grime off my skin. I had cut my hair short and was sporting a 10-day beard. After shampooing and brushing my teeth, I wiped the fogged-up mirror and stared at my reflection. I wondered if I was truly alive or just going through the motions. On Saturday morning, I emailed Nick, "If Lisa hasn't made you sell your bike, meet me for breakfast at 8 o'clock tomorrow at the diner." I loved my Harley. I had driven sports cars before, but nothing compared to the freedom of being on my bike. The rumble of the engine, the wind on my face, and the feeling of vulnerability were exactly what I needed. I ditched my helmet months ago. Shades and a cap were enough for me. By 9:30 a.m., I hit the road. Only one other biker passed by, giving me the peace sign. Most casual riders had stored their bikes for the winter, but the hardcore ones like me waited for the first snowfall before doing the same. Needing an oil change, I stopped at the dealership. "Just an oil change," I told the mechanic. He said it would take about an hour, so I wandered around the showroom. A lime green custom chopper caught my eye, and I swung my leg over it to get a feel for it. The salesman approached and started chatting about the bike. It had a 2008 engine with only 2,200 miles on it, mostly custom Harley parts. He offered me a test ride, but I said I probably couldn't afford it. That's when he mentioned that the owner was open to trades, so I told him about my 2008 Ultra. Before I knew it, I was cruising down the road on the chopper, and it handled like a dream. When I returned, the salesman asked for my thoughts. "A little more vibration than I'd like, but it rides well," I said. He then offered to call the owner. After a brief chat, the owner explained that his wife hated the rear fender pad, so he had to get something more comfortable. "I made that mistake once. Never again," I joked. We discussed some add-ons like saddlebags and a windshield, and after some negotiation, I made the deal. 45 minutes and $8,000 later, I drove off with their bike, and they took mine. It was a win-win. I scheduled an appointment for the following week to swap out the seat and add a rear shock. After about 100 miles, my back couldn't handle the hardtail ride any longer. When I pulled into the diner for breakfast the next day, Nick was already waiting with a cup of coffee. "When did you get this beauty?" he asked, admiring my new ride. "Yesterday. Traded the Ultra for it. What do you think?" "Damn, it's awesome," he replied, spending the next 20 minutes checking it out. "Lisa would kill me if I brought this home." We ordered breakfast, and I told him all about the trade. We caught up on life. Business had slowed for me due to the economy, but we were still expecting a strong fourth quarter. Nick shared that his company had laid off nearly 10% of its workers, and they were just trying to stay afloat. "I never thought I'd be happy just to have a job," he said. "I keep telling the guys to be thankful they're still working." We talked about his wife, Lisa, and her job at the hospital. Though it was secure, it was exhausting. "Sometimes, she's so tired I have to pick her up at 3 a.m. because she can't drive home," Nick said. Then, Nick hesitated before mentioning that Lisa and Carol, my ex, still kept in touch. "She asks about you sometimes," he added. "Don't," I said sharply. "I don't want to hear it." Nick quickly switched topics, laughing about a rumor he had heard, that I had taken out a Sensei's star fighter in the ring. "It wasn't a big deal," I said. "The guy was cocky after dropping someone, so I gave him a couple of sidekicks. Maybe I was too forceful, but he wasn't guarding himself." Nick laughed. "You never do anything halfway." We chatted for another hour before Nick had to leave. He invited me to dinner with Lisa's family, but I declined, citing work. "You can't hide forever," he teased, before taking my bike for a quick ride. When he came back, his eyes were wide. "I need one of these. It's way faster than my wide glide," he said, though he admitted it might not handle well on sharp corners. After Nick left, I spent the afternoon riding my new green chopper, enjoying the open road. Around 6:30 p.m., I stopped at a diner for a quick meal, a burger, onion rings, and a Dr. Pepper. I kept an eye on my bike through the window as a group of girls parked next to it. One of them climbed on, and I wasn't too pleased. "How would you like it if I sat in your car with my feet on the dash?" I asked, surprising them. Two of the girls jumped off, but the one on my bike stayed put. "Is it yours?" she asked. "Yes, and didn't anyone teach you not to touch other people's things?" I didn't know. "My dad would have hotwired it anyway," she said nonchalantly. "How does it ride? And how does anyone sit on that tiny back seat?" "It rides fine, and I don't care about the back seat because no one rides there," I replied, getting annoyed. "Now get off my bike." "Like I'd ruin it with my 105 pounds, she shot back. "I wouldn't ride with you even if you begged." She walked into the diner, and I shook my head, returning to my table. The girls sat at the counter, occasionally glancing my way. When I paid the bill, the skinny brunette approached me. "I'm giving you another chance," she said. "You look like a lost puppy, and I love puppies. You can give me a ride home to apologize for being rude." Surprised, I didn't object. 5 minutes later, we were riding back into town. The faster I went, the tighter she held on. After dropping her off at her place, she complained about the seat and handed me her number. "Call me when you fix the seat," she said, walking toward her apartment. "By the way, I'm Pam." Good-looking but pushy, I thought, slipping her number into my pocket. The month end at work went well, and I managed to secure a 5% price cut from 2 vendors, earning praise from Ken. He even mentioned the possibility of a company car, saying, "Keep it up, and there might be a bonus this year." I got a new gel-filled seat and rear shock for my bike, making it much more comfortable. I also asked the dealer about a better passenger seat and ended up buying a quick-release one for occasional use, even though it cost a fortune. Harley parts always do. I toyed with Pam's number for a week. I hadn't dated much in the past year, just 3 dates, and only one was semi-serious. I finally called her. "Hello, Pam?" "It's Steve," I said, wondering if she remembered me. "Steve who?" she asked. "The guy with the green chopper." "Oh, I thought you were a lost cause. What took you so long to call?" "Work's been busy, and I had to get a few things done to the bike," I explained. "There's a ride this Saturday. Want to join?" "Did you fix the seat?" "Let's just say it's big enough now," I joked. "All right, I'm in. What time?" 9:30. Dress warm. It'll be cold. I've got a leather jacket and boots. I'm good. Just don't be late," she said before hanging up. It felt like I was a teenager asking someone out for the first time. When Saturday came, I bundled up in heavy leathers and gloves. It was freezing. By the time I picked up Pam, I was 5 minutes late. "You're late," she said immediately. "Only by 5 minutes," I replied. "Late is late. Now let me see this new seat," she said, inspecting the bike. We headed out, and Pam held on tightly as we rode. When we got to the dealership, she rubbed her numb face. "That was cold," she said, shivering. I handed her a neoprene mask. "This will help." "It's got a skull on it," she complained. "It's for warmth, not fashion," I said, smiling slightly. The ride began at 10 a.m. and lasted about 2 hours, with 30 bikes joining in, mostly single riders. We returned to the dealership by noon. After declining the cold food they offered, I asked Pam, "Want to grab lunch?" "Yes, but somewhere warm," she replied. We went to a Denny's, where Pam warmed her hands on a coffee mug. "That was fun, though cold," she said. "Do you do this often?" "Not as much as I used to. I used to ride to Sturgis every year, but it's been a while." "I've seen pictures. Is it really that big?" "Bikes everywhere, and it's a nonstop party for 2 weeks. Nick and I camped out once, but now I prefer more comfort." "What do you do for work?" she asked. "I'm a purchasing manager. How about you?" "I teach art and do freelance work. It doesn't pay much, but I enjoy it." We continued chatting, getting to know each other better. Pam was direct, teasing me about taking so long to call her, but I liked her sense of humor. We ended up seeing each other for the next few weekends, getting closer as we shared more of our lives. Each weekend brought new adventures, and I started to feel like I was finally living again. Pam brought a lightheartedness into my life that I hadn't realized I needed. Little did I know, the next few months would change everything. A few months had passed since I first met Pam, and things between us had grown surprisingly comfortable. We continued to see each other regularly, going on long rides and grabbing meals together, sharing stories about our lives and making light of our quirks. Pam was funny, confident, and easy to be around. Exactly what I needed after the emotional wreckage I had been through. Despite this newfound ease, there was always that lingering tension in the air, the unspoken question of whether things would become more serious. And then, of course, there was my past, a shadow that seemed to follow me, no matter how much I tried to leave it behind. One Saturday morning, we were getting ready for a ride when Pam asked me the question I had been dreading. "So, what's the deal with your ex? Carol, right?" I froze, my hands tightening on the handle of the chopper. It wasn't like Pam to press, and I thought I had been good at deflecting questions about my past. We had kept things light so far, and I hadn't felt the need to dive into the darker parts of my life. But there it was, the elephant in the room I couldn't keep ignoring. "Yeah, Carol," I replied, not meeting her eyes. "You never really talk about her, but I can tell there's something there." "Is it over? I mean, really over?" she asked, her tone careful but curious. I sighed, wiping my hands on a rag as I tried to find the right words. How could I explain the mess that had been my marriage? The betrayal, the lies, the humiliation. I hadn't even told Nick the whole story, and he was my best friend. "It's over. Has been for a while," I said, still avoiding her gaze. "It's just complicated. A lot of baggage I'm still dealing with." Pam leaned against the bike, folding her arms as she looked at me thoughtfully. "Complicated how?" I hesitated. I didn't want to open that door, but I knew Pam wasn't the type to back off once she set her mind to something. She deserved the truth, at least part of it. We were married for a few years. It was good at first, but things fell apart. Well, let's just say she wasn't faithful, and I found out in the worst way possible. Pam didn't interrupt. She just waited for me to continue, her eyes softening with understanding. I tried to make it work, but it was impossible. Too much damage. "We're divorced now, but the whole thing messed me up for a while," I admitted, feeling the weight of those words hang in the air. Pam nodded slowly. "I get it. You don't have to go into detail if you don't want to, but I appreciate you telling me." I exhaled, relieved that she wasn't pressing for more. But at the same time, I felt guilty for holding back. There were parts of the story that still haunted me, things that I hadn't worked through myself. I wasn't ready to tell Pam about the betrayal, the humiliation of being tied up and helpless while Carol had her twisted fun with Dan and his buddies. That chapter of my life was one I preferred to bury deep and far away. "Thanks," I said, feeling a bit lighter. "It's not something I like talking about. But yeah, I'm good now." Pam smiled, pushing off from the bike. "Okay, well, I'm not going to pry, but if you ever need to vent, I'm here. Now, are we going to hit the road or stand around talking about your ex all day?" I laughed, grateful for the change of subject. "Let's go. The open road is calling." We spent the rest of the day riding through the countryside, the wind in our faces and the roar of the bike beneath us. Pam didn't bring up Carol again, and I was thankful for that. I wasn't ready to share the whole truth, and for now, it felt good just to be in the moment, enjoying the freedom of the ride with someone who made me feel alive again. But no matter how far I rode, I couldn't completely outrun the past. It was always there, lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to resurface. A few weeks later, that moment came. I was at work, sorting through some invoices when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. It's important." I stared at the message, my stomach sinking as I recognized the area code. It was Carol's. Ignoring the knot of anxiety forming in my chest, I responded quickly. "What do you want?" A few moments passed before the reply came through. "It's about Dan. I didn't know how else to tell you, but he's out of jail." My blood ran cold. Dan, her accomplice in all the madness, was free again? The guy who had humiliated me, tormented me, and turned my life upside down? I stood up from my desk, heart racing, as my mind began to spin. What did she mean by "he's out"? Was he coming for me? Did he still hold a grudge after all these years? I hadn't heard from Dan since everything went down, and the thought of him being back in my life sent a shiver down my spine. I don't want anything to do with this, Carol. Stay away from me, and keep him away too. I threw my phone down onto the desk, trying to focus on the work in front of me, but my mind was racing. All the memories, all the anger, all the unresolved pain. It was flooding back, threatening to overwhelm me. I thought I had left that part of my life behind, but here it was, crashing back into my world like an unwelcome storm. That night, I couldn't sleep. Pam called me, but I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk, not even to her. Not about this. I went into my workout room, pounding the heavy bag for an hour straight, trying to punch the anger out of my system. But it didn't help. The demons were back, and I didn't know how to stop them. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I needed to confront this head-on. Carol and Dan weren't going to haunt me any longer. I had to put an end to it once and for all, and I knew exactly where to start. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I felt more determined than ever. I wasn't going to let Carol or Dan pull me back into that hell. I had spent too much time rebuilding my life, piecing together the parts of myself they had shattered. It was time to put it all to rest on my terms. I grabbed my phone, thumb hovering over Pam's name. She deserved to know what was going on, but a part of me hesitated. She had been a bright spot in my life, and I didn't want to drag her into the mess. Not yet, at least. I shoved the phone into my pocket, deciding to deal with her later. First, I had to handle Carol. I walked outside, the crisp morning air biting at my skin, and started the Harley. The familiar rumble of the engine calmed my nerves, if only for a moment. I wasn't sure what I was going to say to Carol, but I knew where I had to go. The last time we had spoken, she had mentioned that she was living in a rundown apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't the type of place you'd expect her to end up in, but then again, nothing about Carol was predictable. The ride over felt longer than it should have. My mind raced with 1,000 different scenarios. What if Dan was already there, waiting for me? What if Carol tried to manipulate me like she had so many times before? By the time I pulled up to her building, my heart was pounding. The building was exactly what I imagined it would be. Old, weathered, and forgotten. The kind of place you end up when life's promises run dry. I parked the bike, took a deep breath, and made my way inside. The musty smell of the hallway hit me as soon as I stepped in, and I felt like I was walking into a bad memory. Her door was on the second floor. I stood there for a moment, staring at the faded number, wondering if I was making a mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. I knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed down the hallway. It took a few moments, but the door creaked open. Carol stood there, looking older, more worn than I remembered. The years hadn't been kind to her. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Steve, I didn't think you'd actually come." I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. "You said it was important." She stepped aside, letting me in. The apartment was small and cluttered, a far cry from the life we used to have. There was an awkward silence as she closed the door behind me. "You want a drink or something?" she asked, her voice uneasy. "No, I'm not here for small talk, Carol. What's going on with Dan?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "He's out. I wasn't sure if you'd heard, but he's been asking about you." My stomach twisted. I had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed didn't make it any easier. "What does he want?" Carol hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if she didn't want to say it out loud. He wants revenge. He blames you for everything that happened." I clenched my fists, fighting back the anger rising inside me. "Of course he does. And what about you? Are you part of his plan too?" She shook her head quickly. "No, Steve. I haven't seen him since he got out. I swear. I just thought you should know. I didn't want him to come after you without warning." I studied her face, trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. Carol had always been a good liar, but there was something different about her now. She looked scared, genuinely afraid. "And what do you expect me to do with this information?" I asked, my voice cold. "I don't know," she said, her voice rising in frustration. "I just thought, maybe you could stop him, talk to him, make him see that it's over." "Talk to him?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "After everything he did? You really think he'll listen to me?" Carol looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I don't know, Steve. I'm just trying to make things right. I shook my head, pacing the small living room. You should have thought about making things right years ago, Carol. When you and Dan decided to ruin my life. She flinched at my words but didn't argue. I know I messed up, but I'm not that person anymore. I stopped, turning to face her. I don't care who you are now, Carol. I care about the fact that Dan is out, and you're telling me he's coming after me. That's all I need to know. She took a step toward me, her voice softening. Steve, I'm scared too. I don't know what he's capable of anymore. I stared at her, a flood of emotions hitting me all at once. Anger, resentment, a touch of pity. But none of it changed the fact that I couldn't trust her. Not after everything that had happened. I'll take care of Dan, I said, my voice low but firm. But after that, we're done. For good. Carol's face fell, but she nodded. Okay. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, she called after me. Steve, be careful. I didn't respond. I walked out, the door closing behind me with a hollow thud. The ride home was a blur. My mind raced with thoughts of Dan, of what he might try, of how I was going to deal with him. It was as if all the progress I had made in the past few years was unraveling. The freedom I had found on my Harley, the quiet moments of peace, they all felt distant now. When I got back to my condo, I realized there was one person I needed to talk to, not because I needed advice, but because I couldn't keep shutting her out. Pam. I sat down, took out my phone, and called her. The phone rang a few times before she picked up. Hey, stranger, she said, her voice warm. I was starting to think you forgot about me. I smiled despite everything. No, I didn't forget. I've been dealing with some stuff. Yeah? You want to talk about it? Yeah, I do, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Okay, come over tonight. I'll be there, I promised. As I hung up, I felt a sense of relief. Maybe I wasn't alone in this after all. But I knew one thing for certain. Dan wasn't going to go away quietly, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. Later that night, as I rode over to Pam's place, the cold wind biting at my face, I tried to think about how I was going to explain all this to her. Pam deserved the truth, even if I wasn't sure how much I could say without losing her. I'd been holding back too long, shutting her out of the darker parts of my life, and I could feel the walls I'd built starting to crumble. When I pulled up to her apartment, she was already waiting outside, her arms crossed against the chill. She looked concerned, but there was that same warm smile she always had when she saw me. It was the kind of smile that made me want to forget everything else and just be with her. You made it, she said, stepping toward me as I got off the bike. I did. Sorry for being distant lately. Pam shook her head, waving off my apology. You're here now. That's what matters. We headed inside, her apartment warm and cozy, filled with the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee. She motioned for me to sit on the couch while she poured us both a cup. I took off my jacket and sat down, trying to figure out how to start. So, she said, handing me a mug and sitting beside me, what's been going on? I sipped the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me. It's a lot, Pam. I don't even know where to begin. Start wherever you need to, she replied, her voice gentle. I'm here. I stared down at the coffee, gathering my thoughts. Then I finally spoke. Do you remember when I told you about my ex, Carol? Pam nodded. Yeah, I remember. You said things ended badly. Well, it was worse than I let on. A lot worse. Her eyes softened, but she didn't say anything, letting me continue. We were married for a few years, and in the beginning, things were good. But then it all fell apart. She started experimenting, wanting things in our relationship that I wasn't comfortable with. At first, I went along with it, thinking it would bring us closer, but it didn't. I paused, taking another sip of coffee before going on. One night, she invited two guys over. I thought it was supposed to be some kind of party, but it turned into something else. They tied me up and, well, let's just say they did whatever they wanted while I was helpless. Pam's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. I spent hours tied up, unable to do anything, while they had their fun. Afterward, I found out it had all been Carol's idea. She had set the whole thing up, planned it out, and made sure I couldn't do a damn thing about it. I could see the shock and sympathy in Pam's expression, but she remained quiet, letting me tell the story in my own time. I left her after that. I couldn't stay with someone who would do that to me. But the worst part is, one of the guys, Dan, he's out of jail now. He blames me for everything that happened, and I just found out from Carol that he's been asking about me. Pam's expression shifted from shock to concern. What do you mean? He's been asking about you. Is he coming after you? I don't know, I admitted. Carol seems to think he's out for revenge. And given everything that happened, I wouldn't be surprised if he's planning something. Pam set down her coffee, leaning in closer. Steve, this sounds serious. You can't just ignore this. I'm not ignoring it, I said, my voice firmer than I intended. But I don't know what to do yet. Part of me wants to confront him, put an end to this once and for all. But I know that's risky. Dan's not exactly the type to talk things out. Pam took a deep breath, her hands clasped together in her lap. Have you thought about going to the police? I don't have any proof that he's planning anything. Carol's the only one who's said anything, and I don't trust her as far as I can throw her. For all I know, she's just trying to stir up trouble. Pam frowned, clearly not satisfied with my answer. Even if you don't have proof, it's better to be safe than sorry. You could at least file a report, let them know what's going on. I shook my head. The last thing I want is to get the cops involved. Dan's been out of jail for a while now, and if he hasn't done anything yet, I don't want to provoke him. Pam sighed, rubbing her temples. I just don't want you to get hurt. If this guy's as dangerous as you say, you need to protect yourself. I appreciated her concern, but I knew that going to the police wouldn't solve anything. Dan was the kind of guy who thrived on confrontation. If I went to the cops, it would only escalate things. I'll handle it, I said, trying to reassure her. I won't let him get the upper hand. Pam looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? I don't want to see you get caught up in something you can't walk away from. I promise, I said, though part of me wasn't entirely sure I could keep that promise. We spent the rest of the night talking, but the conversation drifted away from Dan and Carol. Pam told me about her week, about the art classes she'd been teaching, and we laughed over some of her students' more ridiculous projects. For a little while, it felt like things were normal again, like I wasn't being haunted by the ghosts of my past. But as I left her apartment later that night, the weight of everything came crashing back down. Dan was out there, somewhere, and I had no idea what he was planning. I had promised Pam I'd be careful, but I wasn't sure how I could be. Not when it felt like a storm was brewing just over the horizon. The next few days were a blur of work and sleepless nights. I tried to keep my mind on my job, but every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be Carol with more bad news about Dan. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Pam checked in with me regularly, always asking if I'd heard anything new. I hadn't, and part of me hoped that maybe Dan had moved on. Maybe Carol was wrong. Maybe he wasn't coming for me. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't until Thursday night that I got the call I'd been dreading. I was sitting in my condo, trying to distract myself with some mindless TV, when my phone rang. The number wasn't one I recognized, but something told me to answer it. Hello? There was a brief pause on the other end before a familiar voice spoke. Hey, Steve. My blood ran cold. Dan. The line was silent for a moment, and I could almost hear him grinning through the phone. Surprised to hear from me? What do you want, Dan? I asked, my voice tight. Oh, come on now. No need to be so hostile. I just wanted to catch up, see how you've been. It's been a while, hasn't it? I gripped the phone tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. Cut the crap, Dan. What do you want? He chuckled softly, the sound sending a chill down my spine. I think you know what I want, Steve. You ruined my life, and now it's time for me to return the favor. My pulse quickened. You did that to yourself. I didn't ruin anything. That's not how I see it, Dan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. You made sure I went to jail while you got to walk away clean. Now I'm going to make sure you pay for that. I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to keep my voice steady. What are you planning, Dan? You think you can come after me and get away with it? He laughed again, but there was no humor in it. I'm not stupid, Steve. I'm not going to show up at your door with a gun. I've learned my lesson. No, I'm going to do something much worse. I'm going to destroy everything you care about, piece by piece, and I'm going to enjoy every second of it. A surge of anger flared inside me. You stay the hell away from Pam, I growled. Oh, Pam, that's her name, huh? Dan's voice was mocking, cruel. Don't worry, I've got no interest in your little girlfriend, but I will make sure she knows just what kind of man she's dating. You can count on that. I clenched my jaw, my free hand balling into a fist. If you come near her, I swear to God. You'll what, Steve? Dan interrupted, his voice sharp. You'll stop me? You couldn't stop me back then, and you won't stop me now. I've already got everything in motion. You can't undo what's coming. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there, staring at the phone in my hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Dan was coming for me. He had made that clear. But what did he mean by everything in motion? What the hell was he planning? I couldn't think straight. My thoughts were racing, my heart pounding. I needed to do something, anything, but I didn't know where to start. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to move, to get out of that apartment before I lost my mind. I ended up at Pam's place. She opened the door, surprised to see me standing there, breathless and clearly shaken. Steve? What's wrong? She asked, concern etched on her face. I need to talk to you, I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She closed the door behind me, her expression growing more serious. What happened? It's Dan, I said, running a hand through my hair. He called me. He's planning something, Pam. Something bad. Pam's eyes widened. What did he say? I told her everything. About the call, about his threats, about how he was going to destroy everything I cared about. Pam listened quietly, but I could see the worry growing in her eyes. Steve, this is serious, she said when I finished. You can't just ignore this. You have to go to the police. I can't, I said, shaking my head. I don't have any proof. All I have is a phone call. That's enough to at least file a report, she insisted. They can't just do nothing if you're being threatened. I sat down on her couch, my head in my hands. I don't know what to do, Pam. If I go to the cops, it might make things worse. Dan's not the type to back off. If anything, it'll just piss him off more. Pam knelt in front of me, her hands gently resting on mine. I know you're scared, and I know you don't want to make things worse, but you can't do this alone. You need help. I looked into her eyes, seeing the fear and concern there. She wasn't just worried about me. She was worried for herself too. Dan's threats weren't just aimed at me anymore. If he knew about Pam, if he knew where she lived, she could be in danger too. I don't want you to get hurt, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Then let me help you, Pam replied softly. We'll figure this out together. But you can't keep pushing me away. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. I had been trying to protect Pam by keeping her out of this, but now I realized I couldn't do it on my own. I'll go to the police tomorrow, I said, finally giving in. You're right. I can't handle this alone. Pam smiled, squeezing my hands. Good. We'll go together. We'll figure this out. As I sat there with Pam, the weight on my chest began to lift just a little. For the first time in days, I didn't feel completely alone in this nightmare. But even as I tried to take comfort in her presence, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dan was already one step ahead of me. The next morning, Pam and I went to the police station together. I filed a report detailing the threats Dan had made over the phone. The officer at the desk took down my statement and said they would look into it, but I could tell by his tone that he wasn't convinced anything would come of it. Without solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I change my phone number, install security cameras, and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. It wasn't exactly comforting, but it was something. When we left the station, Pam took my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We'll get through this, she said, her voice filled with determination. I nodded, trying to believe her. But deep down, I knew that filing a report wasn't going to stop Dan. If anything, it might have made him more dangerous. For the next few days, I kept a low profile. I went to work, came home, and spent my nights checking the locks on my doors and windows, waiting for something to happen. Pam stayed with me most nights, and her presence helped keep the anxiety at bay, but the tension never fully left. Then, one night, it happened. I was asleep when I heard the sound of shattering glass. I shot up in bed, heart racing, as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bedside. Pam stirred beside me, her eyes wide with fear. "Steve? What was that?" "Stay here," I whispered, getting out of bed and moving toward the noise. I crept through the dark apartment, my grip tight on the bat, every sense on high alert. When I reached the living room, I saw the source of the noise. The front window was smashed, shards of glass scattered across the floor. And there, lying in the middle of the room, was a brick. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and turned it over. Taped to the side was a piece of paper. "This is just the beginning." I stared at the note, a cold wave of fear washing over me. Dan was here, and he wasn't done yet. The sight of the brick and the ominous note sent a chill down my spine. My heart raced, and my grip tightened around the baseball bat. Dan had made his first move, and now it was clear. He wasn't going to stop until he'd torn my life apart. I turned around and saw Pam standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice trembling. I handed her the note, not trusting myself to speak. She read it quickly, her face growing pale. "We need to call the police." "We will," I replied, my voice low and steady. "But first, we need to get out of here. We're not safe in this apartment." Pam nodded in agreement, already moving to grab her things. I quickly packed a bag with some essentials and pulled my jacket on. I didn't know where we were going, but staying in that apartment with broken windows and the clear threat of Dan looming over us wasn't an option. As we drove away from my place, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Dan's car tailing us. Pam was quiet beside me, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. I could see the fear in her eyes, but she wasn't panicking. If anything, she seemed determined, ready to face whatever came next. We checked into a hotel on the other side of town, paying cash for the room. It wasn't the fanciest place, but it was safe, and that was all that mattered. After we settled in, I called the police and reported the incident. They sent an officer to take down the details, but again, without clear evidence or knowing where Dan was, they couldn't do much beyond promising to increase patrols around the area. After the officer left, I sat down on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. I felt trapped, like no matter what I did, Dan was always going to be one step ahead. Pam sat next to me, placing a hand on my back. "We'll figure this out," she said softly. "We just have to be smart about it." I looked up at her, grateful for her strength, but unsure of how much more I could take. "I don't know if I can keep running, Pam. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder." "You won't have to," she said, her voice firm. "We're going to stop him." "But how?" I asked, feeling the weight of everything crushing down on me. "Dan's unpredictable. He knows how to get to me, and I don't even know where he is." Pam was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she looked at me, her eyes filled with resolve. "We need to turn the tables on him. We've been reacting to everything he does, letting him call the shots. It's time to take control." "How?" I asked, intrigued but skeptical. "We know he's watching us," Pam said, her mind already working through the plan. "He knows where you live, but he doesn't know we've moved. Let's use that to our advantage." I stared at her, starting to catch on. "You want to bait him?" She nodded. "We need to get him out in the open, where the police can catch him. If we can get him to show his hand, we can finally put an end to this." It was a dangerous plan, and the risks were high. But she was right. Dan had the upper hand because he was calling the shots. If we could lure him into a trap, we might finally have a way to stop him for good. "I don't like the idea of putting you in danger," I said, my voice serious. "I'm already in danger, Steve," she replied, her voice unwavering. "But we're in this together. And if this is the only way to stop him, then we have to try." I nodded, knowing she was right. We couldn't keep running. We had to face this head-on. The next morning, we put our plan into motion. I rented a car under a false name and used a burner phone to send a message to Dan. The message was simple, vague enough to pique his interest, but clear enough to let him know where to find me. "Meet me at my apartment tonight. Let's settle this once and for all. 9 p.m. We knew he'd take the bait. Dan was the type who thrived on confrontation, and if he thought he had a chance to corner me, he wouldn't pass it up. Once the message was sent, Pam and I drove back to my apartment. The police were already there, waiting in unmarked cars, ready for anything. They had set up surveillance around the building, and an officer stayed hidden inside, ready to act the moment Dan showed up. We sat in the dark, waiting. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Pam sat beside me, her hand resting on mine, offering silent support. Neither of us spoke much. There wasn't much left to say. We were committed to the plan, and now we just had to wait for Dan to make his move. At exactly 9 p.m., I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. My heart leapt into my throat as I peered out the window, spotting a black sedan parking across the street. The door opened, and a figure stepped out, tall, broad, and unmistakable. Dan. He looked around, scanning the area before making his way toward the apartment. He moved cautiously, clearly suspecting a trap but too arrogant to turn back now. I gripped Pam's hand, my breath shallow as we watched from our vantage point. The officers were in position, ready to move the moment Dan stepped inside. He reached the front door, paused for a moment, and then opened it, slipping inside. My pulse quickened, every nerve in my body on edge. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Then, I heard it, the sound of a struggle, shouts, and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. I sprang up from my spot, running to the door with Pam close behind. By the time we reached the hallway, it was over. Dan was pinned to the ground, an officer kneeling on his back as he cuffed him. Dan was shouting, his voice filled with rage. "You think this is over, Steve? You think you can stop me? You're a dead man." I stood there, watching as they hauled him to his feet, his face twisted with fury. He looked at me, his eyes wild and full of hate. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him. As the officers led him out of the building, Pam came up beside me, her hand resting on my arm. "It's over," she said softly. I nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. Dan was gone. For good this time. The next few days felt surreal. The constant anxiety, the fear of looking over my shoulder, it was all gone. Dan was behind bars again, facing charges for stalking and making threats. This time, there was no doubt he'd be going away for a long time. Pam and I returned to the hotel for a few days, just to be safe, but I knew we didn't need to run anymore. I could finally breathe again. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of our hotel room, watching the sun set over the city, I turned to Pam. "Thank you," I said, my voice quiet but filled with gratitude. She smiled, her eyes warm. "For what?" "For sticking by me. For not giving up." Pam reached over, taking my hand in hers. "I told you, we're in this together. I wasn't going to let you fight this battle alone." I squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. As the last rays of sunlight faded over the horizon, I realized something. Pam and I had faced something dark and dangerous together, and we had come out on the other side stronger. The ghosts of my past were finally gone, and in their place, I had found something new, hope. And as long as I had Pam by my side, I knew I could face whatever came next. In the weeks that followed, things slowly returned to normal. I went back to work, got my apartment fixed up, and tried to pick up the pieces of my life. Pam moved in with me, and we started talking about the future, what we wanted, where we saw ourselves in a few years. It was strange, thinking about the future again after so long, but it was also exciting. Dan's trial came and went. He was sentenced to a long stint in prison, and this time, I knew he wasn't getting out anytime soon. The chapter of my life that had been overshadowed by him was finally closed, and I was ready to move on. One evening, a few months later, Pam and I were sitting on the balcony of our now-repaired apartment, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights below. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," I admitted, my voice soft. Pam looked up at me, her eyes filled with warmth. "What do you mean?" "I never thought I'd find someone who made me feel whole. After everything that happened with Carol, I thought I was broken for good." Pam smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. You're not broken, Steve. You just needed time to heal.